During a dinner honoring my father's political career, one of the advisors looked at me coldly and commented casually, "Curious choice of words today. Reminds me of the writings of a certain librarian who used to be around here." My heart stopped for 2 seconds. I laughed, elegantly, as I was taught. But inside, an earthquake. What had been just between me and Elle was beginning to seep into the corridors of the elite, like a loose thread in a gala gown. If they pulled, everything would unravel. And yet, even knowing we were on the verge of falling, I wrote that night, with more fervor than ever, as if I knew this love needed to be fully realized before they stripped us of the freedom to feel it. I no longer knew where pretense ended and truth began. Or maybe I knew, but I could no longer pretend I didn't. The face the mirror reflected every morning was still the same, flawless, composed, the face of Thessalia Virel, daughter of a senator, cultural ambassador of a programmed future. But inside, I burned. My body was present at engagements, cocktail parties, photos, and interviews. But my soul? It was in the library, waiting for him, waiting for Elle. And then it happened. It wasn't how I imagined. There was no soundtrack, no accidental brush of hands, no eyes meeting by chance. It was simple, direct, brutally human. I arrived earlier than usual. There was a brief window between 2 engagements, and the urge to write seized me almost physically. As I turned the corner of the central shelves, he was already there, standing, his back to me, reorganizing books with the calm of someone who knew he'd be found. He didn't turn immediately. Maybe he was as nervous as I was. Or maybe he wanted to give me the chance to leave. But I didn't leave. "You're Elle, aren't you?" It was all I could say, my voice softer than a whisper. He turned finally and smiled. Not a wide, toothy smile. It was a sad, gentle smile, like someone who also carries the weight of holding back too much. His eyes were brown and tired, yet alive, as if they'd read more than books. He nodded with an almost imperceptible tilt of his head and said, "And you're what I never had the courage to imagine was real." After that, time moved unevenly. We talked, yes, a little, a lot. I don't remember. I remember the texture of his voice, the way he said my name as if afraid to profane it, the way he avoided touching me. That love, born in the shadows of words, was now exposed to the light, and that made it more fragile, more dangerous, but also more beautiful. We shared only a brush of fingers that afternoon, and it was more intimate than any embrace, and riskier than any scandal. After that, everything changed. We began meeting in nearly invisible intervals, hidden in the cracks of routine. In forgotten corridors, in notes left inside children's books no one read anymore. With each meeting, it became harder to return to the roles the world demanded of us. My fiancé, the one whose hand I was supposed to accept for strategic reasons, began to notice the distance. Subtle comments arose. Glances grew longer. The walls were closing in, but I was no longer the woman who would live behind them. One day, I slipped a letter into the pocket of Ellie's jacket with just one sentence. "If the world turns its back on me, will you still be facing me?" And hours later, tucked between the pages of an anatomy book, I found his reply. It was his handwriting, yes, but shaky, brief, scared, and sincere. Yes, even if it turns on me, too. There was a new tension in the air, not just between me and the world, but within me, as if every step I took with Elle was also a countdown. I loved him. Not in a fanciful way, but with the kind of love that doesn't ask permission to exist, that pulses even when you try to suffocate it. But we knew, both of us knew, it couldn't last like this. There was no longer a safe space, no letter hidden that couldn't be found. And yet, I continued, not out of stubbornness, but because I no longer knew how to live without it. My parents were restless. My mother began watching me with the same subtlety she uses to adjust her wine glass before a toast, as if she wanted to align me with the rest of the decor. My father was more direct. He started taking me to private events, discreet meetings, as if trying to distract me, redirect me, test my limits. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they knew something was off script. And when a virel goes off script, their world begins to tremble. It was on a Saturday morning, when everything seemed too calm, that the first real crack appeared. One of the family's secretaries called me discreetly to the reading room. There, on the mahogany table was a beige folder. Inside, a letter, one of mine, the one where I wrote that I could no longer stand being seen as a prize in political showcases. The one where I wrote, with complete sincerity, I want to be chosen by someone who sees me when I'm not smiling. The letter was marked up. Words underlined as if they were crimes. They looked at me as if I'd betrayed an entire country. And maybe, to them, I had. My father was clear. If another scandal arose, my image would be destroyed, and with it, everything the family had built. I stayed silent. For the first time, I didn't apologize. I didn't beg for understanding. I just looked at him, the man who raised me like I was a flag, and I realized that if I stayed there, I'd keep fluttering in someone else's wind, never my own. That night I met Elle for the last time as we had before. The touch was brief, almost sacred. He asked me to run away with him, said he'd leave everything, start from scratch. And for a second, for a whole moment, I wanted to. More than anything. But running would be throwing our letters into the fire, unread by anyone. I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to be read. I wanted to be heard. So I did what I always feared. I wrote the final letter, but not to him, to the world. I never thought courage had a sound, but that night, as I sealed the white envelope with trembling hands and placed it in the middle of my speech, I heard it, a sharp snap, an almost insignificant sound, but inside me it rang like a door being unlocked after years of being bolted shut. I knew what I was about to do. I knew my words would cut through the gala hall like an arrow, piercing not just the silence, but everything that sustained me, name, title, promised future. But I also knew I could no longer be a woman who writes in the dark while the world applauds her for her light. The night of the event arrived with all the signs of spectacle. Soft lights, shimmering dresses, glasses raised in toasts to the Virel family's political legacy. I walked to the stage with the perfect steps my mother taught me. I sat beside my fiancé. He smiled at me. I smiled back. Nothing in my face revealed that inside I was no longer that woman. When they announced my name, the room fell silent. I took the paper with the speech prepared by aides, the one about youth, tradition, continuity, and left it folded on the marble podium. Instead, I pulled out the envelope, my letter, my voice. "Good evening," I began, and the microphone seemed to amplify not just the sound but the vertigo. Tonight I was asked to speak about the future, about legacy, about duty. I breathed, but I'm going to talk about love. A murmur rippled through the hall. My father shifted in his chair. My mother's fingers froze, and I continued. I read the entire letter from start to finish with the steady voice of someone who no longer needed permission. I spoke of the man who never appeared in photos but saw me better than any flash. I spoke of the letters we exchanged, of the love cultivated outside salons and palaces. I spoke of the woman I became because someone had the courage to read me without wanting to correct me. When I finished, there were no applause. There was silence, and it was the most honest silence I'd ever heard. I stepped off the stage without looking to the sides. My mother didn't try to stop me. My fiancé remained still. My father, Well, he knew he hadn't just lost a daughter to rebellion, but a woman to truce. And maybe deep down, he understood that the strength he always wanted to show the world had finally awakened. But it was mine, and no one would control it anymore. The next day, my face was everywhere. Headlines, social media, furious editorials, and praising columns battled over what I'd done. The rebel princess, the heiress who tore up the script, the reckless romantic. Each outlet told a version. None knew the whole truth. None knew what it was to write with a heart, in flames and hide with cold hands. None knew what it was to love someone in silence until the moment silence became more painful than the risk of being heard. I was barred from public engagements. The phone calls stopped. The house grew tense. My fiancé, now ex, made it clear, through aides, that the engagement was over. No scandals, no direct accusations, just a cold, surgical disconnection, like turning off the lights in an empty hall. My parents retreated into proud silence. They didn't shout, they didn't cry, they just withdrew. And in that withdrawal, it became clear that their love, for me, had always been conditional on my obedient silence. But despite it all, I felt something I'd never felt before: peace. I went to the library that late afternoon, out of instinct, out of memory, out of longing. I didn't expect anything. No letter, no note, no shadow. But he was there. Elle was there, standing, leaning against the shelf that had housed our words, as if the whole world was still made of just that, of us two and the books. His eyes met mine with the pain of someone expecting to be sent away, but also with the hope of someone who still believed our love hadn't expired. "Did you do this for me?" he asked, his voice low, fragile. I shook my head. They say every princess lives in a castle, but no one mentions that behind the gilded walls there's too much silence. Not the kind that soothes, but the kind that weighs, crushes, and slowly drains the soul. I grew up in an old mansion in the Virginia hills, surrounded by perfect gardens and people who never said what they truly thought. Everything around me was choreographed: the greetings, the dinners, even the smiles. My name, Thessalia Virel, always came with reverence, expectation, and pressure. They shaped me to be a symbol of something I didn't choose, and yet I obeyed. Because that's what's expected of someone like me: to smile when you want to scream, to wave when you want to run, to marry when they tell you, to whom they tell you. But there was a space no one occupied, a space that was mine alone, hidden in the folds of what they called a perfect life. I began writing letters, not as a hobby, but out of desperation. Letters with no sender, no expectation of a reply. They were born from the most stifled part of me, where the questions no one allowed me to ask resided. What did I want? Who would I be if no one was watching? I wrote as if I were bleeding, and I bled with an elegance we're taught to call strength. I wrote at night, when the mansion slept. The faint light of the lamp reflected on the heavy curtains, and everything around me seemed suspended. The words flowed from my pen like secrets whispered to the wind. They were for someone who didn't exist, or perhaps existed only in places no one else bothered to look. I imagined him with steady hands and a calm gaze. He didn't wear a suit or carry important surnames. He was a man made of silence and presence. I didn't need to see his face. It was enough to imagine he'd listen without interrupting, without trying to fix anything, without wanting to make me more acceptable. It was to him that I wrote, and when I finished, I folded the paper carefully, as if each fold were a sacred act, and hid the letter between the pages of forgotten books in the library downstairs. No one went there, no one read books anymore. They preferred contracts, emails, cold speeches on letterhead. For weeks I continued, a sacred, secret ritual. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't expect anything. Writing was my only way to breathe when everything around me was the suffocation of duty. Until one night, when I pulled a dusty copy of Emily Dickinson from the shelf, I found a letter that wasn't mine. Even before opening it, my heart already knew. The envelope was the same kind I used. The handwriting, soft, angular, intimate. The ink seemed fresh, but the feeling was of something written centuries ago, as if someone had entered my soul and found the way back. It was signed with a single initial, L. And in that moment, alone among forgotten shelves, I realized the impossible had found me first. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the worn leather armchair in the library, clutching the letter to my chest as if holding a spark in a dry field. I reread it 10 times, maybe more. There were no promises, no grand revelations, just words. But what words? They danced on the page as if written inside my mind by someone who heard the whispers I didn't even dare voice. I sensed someone hides pain between the pages of these books, a pain elegant, polite, but pain nonetheless. And if I'm right, perhaps this letter will find the one who also writes in the dark. That was all. And a signature that wasn't a signature. Just an L. In the days that followed, I lived as if carrying a glass secret in my chest. Fragile, precious, impossible to share. I walked the halls with my usual poise, attended engagements with my usual politeness, but something in me had already broken, and at the same time been set free. I returned to the library every night, as if it were a sacred ritual. I began leaving letters addressed to L, with care and urgency, like writing to a lighthouse through the fog, and he replied, always with few words, but with a precision that wounded and healed at once. He spoke of books, music, memory, and of me without ever saying my name. It was as if he knew someone inside me had been waiting a long time to be truly seen. I was trained to read intentions between the lines. But with L, there were no disguises. He didn't seem to know who I was outside the letters, and I didn't know who he was in this real, concrete world of titles and political thrones. But in words, we were equals, bound by a silent sadness that sought refuge on paper. I began to observe more. Every staff member in the house, every visitor, every unfamiliar face. I looked for gestures, a lingering glance, a book out of place, a clue. L's identity became a silent obsession, but it was a sweet obsession, the kind that warms your hands even in the middle of autumn. And it was on an ordinary afternoon, while accompanying my mother at a charity event, that I realized my attention was no longer there. While everyone smiled for the cameras, my heart was in the library, my body on the stage, but my soul sitting among books, waiting for a new letter. And in that chasm between what the world saw and what I truly felt, I understood. Something in me had begun to change. The obedient girl was giving way to a woman who, even without the courage to say it aloud, was already in love. The next reply took longer than usual. 1 day, 2, 3. My heart, once intoxicated by our silent exchange, began to shrink. I started to think he'd discovered who I was and pulled away. Maybe he was afraid, or worse, disdainful. The world taught me that my name opens doors, but it never guaranteed it could make someone stay. The absence of a letter was like a room without light, and I, alone in it, groped the walls for any sign that it hadn't all been a delusion. On the 4th day, I found the envelope. It was tucked between the pages of a book of modern poetry, one I'd never choose to read, but that L might have chosen to hide something in. The handwriting was the same, but the tone, it had changed. It was tenser, as if written with a restless soul. He said he'd been watched, that he might not be able to reply as often, that the library would no longer be safe for a while. But still, he had written. Even in silence, I'll keep reading you. Those words etched themselves into me with the force of a vow. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote the longest letter yet. For the first time, I let real clues slip. A childhood memory near the rose greenhouse, an indirect mention of my voice, of my public presence. It was risky, I knew, but something in me no longer accepted the prison of hiding completely. If the world wanted to keep me as a symbol of perfection, I needed at least one space where I could be flawed, vulnerable, true. But what I didn't expect was that this space would begin to crumble. The following Sunday, during a private dinner with foreign dignitaries, I noticed my father's eyes lingering on me too long. He'd always watched me, but that day, his expression was different, as if he were trying to decipher me. My mother, ever more subtle, asked vague questions about recent readings, the library, new interests. They were disguises, of course. They knew something. Maybe they'd seen a movement, an exchange, a misplaced note. Maybe Elle had been seen, and in that moment, surrounded by silver cutlery and rehearsed faces, I understood. What I shared with Elle was no longer just mine. The secret that saved me was slowly beginning to threaten the castle they'd built around me. And yet, for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt the urge to run. The nights grew long again, but they were no longer silent. Every word I wrote hurt more, as if my heart knew the freedom won through those letters had an expiration date. With every step in the hallway, I heard echoes where there had once been only routine. They were watching. I didn't know who exactly or how much they knew, but I felt it. The air was denser, the glances more calculated. The library, once my secret temple, now felt like a stage with half-open curtains, where I played a role someone was beginning to unravel. Even so, I returned. Because not returning would be worse than being discovered. The urge to give up was there, but it was smaller than my hunger for truth. At the back of the central shelf, where old romances shared space with my grandfather's annotated speeches, I found a new letter. He'd risked again, but this time it was different. The Smay letter was more personal, more alive. He spoke of my handwriting, recognizable because he'd spent his life studying others' words. He spoke of how I folded my letters, methodical but with a melancholic delicacy. And finally, he spoke of the sense of absence that consumed him. Whenever he passed the spot where the previous letter used to be, it was him. A real man. Someone who walked the same halls as I did, perhaps during the day, perhaps after everyone slept. Someone invisible to my family's eyes, but profoundly present within me. The library was no longer just a place. It was the body of a faceless love, where each shelf was a rib and each letter a heartbeat. The only certainty I had left was this. He saw me, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, an intuition that transcended appearance, status, surname. Began to change. Little by little, my automatic smile lost its strength. My speeches had longer pauses. I wore dresses with small embroidered symbols only he would understand. A swallow, a curved line, a wildflower. In interviews, I dropped disguised clues, fragments of the letters, quotes only he would recognize. It was like writing to him with my own body, a silent dance between two worlds, the visible and the true. But of course, the world around me wasn't blind. I did it for me, I replied. But I only had the courage because of you. He stepped closer, for the first time, without hesitation. And when his hand touched my face, I felt every risk had been worth it. None of the letters had been in vain. What began as refuge was now choice, presence, reality. We sat there on the old wooden floor, without haste, without paper, without ink. For the first time, our words didn't need to be written, just spoken, slowly, between pauses and deep breaths. We talked about everything and nothing. We cried a little, laughed more. And in the silence of the library, we promised one simple thing, that the truth between us would never again be silenced. The world didn't change because of me. The headlines gave way to fresher scandals. The gala halls continued their dances, with new princesses trained to smile on cue. My father returned to his speeches, my mother to her calculated appearances. The Virel family kept its shine, only now without the daughter who was once its most polished trophy. E, on the other hand, discovered what it's like to live without paper or rehearsal. Elle and I left the city, not to escape, but to breathe. We went to a small place, with more trees than people, more time than obligations. There we learned that love, when exposed to the light, doesn't die. It blooms, but it blooms differently, more human, more imperfect. Less poetry, more presence. Sometimes we argue, sometimes we're silent, but we never write out of desperation anymore. Now we write to remember. Yes, we still write letters, not out of necessity, but by choice, out of love for our origin. They're kept in a light wooden box on the top shelf of our bookcase. Sometimes we reread a few, other times we leave them untouched, like a reliquary of what we dared to feel when no one allowed us to. I reclaimed my name, Thessalia Virel, but now it doesn't define me. It belongs to me. I write for small newspapers, give talks at public schools, teach girls to turn pain into words. I don't want to be an icon. I want to be a mirror for those who don't yet know they can choose, that they can be read, that they can be heard, and our love, it no longer needs to hide. It no longer lives between shelves, but in glances exchanged upon waking, in hands that touch without fear, in silent coffees where the greatest luxury is simply being, together, alive, real. If someone asks me if it was worth losing everything for love, I'll say I didn't lose. I only stopped belonging to what was never mine. And finally, I became body, soul, and word. Truly the one person who dared to read me before anyone else. Me. Sometimes I catch myself watching Elle sleep. The same man who, without knowing my name, wrote words that set me free. He breathes slowly, his chest rising and falling, as if the world is no longer in a hurry. And maybe it isn't, at least not ours. Our world now fits inside a modest house, in mornings that begin without obligations, in silences that aren't, empty but comforting. Sometimes someone recognizes me on the street. They say they expected more from me, that I had a bright future, and I smile. Because no one knows how much that brightness dimmed everything inside me. I had a ready-made future, yes, but now I have a true present. And in the back of the closet, among books and memories, I still keep the first letter he wrote to me. I still read it. I still feel it. But now, I live.